So the last videos gave a good introduction of the U.S. during the war, or on the home front, the U.S. Workers at home and people on the home front. Um, and then also getting into specifically what war bonds and rationing are. Now we're going to do a little bit of a zoom out again, um, to evaluate holistically how successful were the government efforts to build support for World War II. As you finish watching this video, I've made an outline for you of the topics of war mobilization and how the government handled that, and then also financing, how the government financed the war. So here are the terms that I want you to specifically look for. They talk about the War Powers Act of 1941, and then it was again renewed the next year. This was passed soon after Pearl Harbor, when the nation was kind of in shock after the attack, the surprise attack, and it expanded the powers of the president and the executive branch and allowed them to do a lot of reorganization of these independent war agencies that then had a lot of power. In a time of war and shock, the nation comes together, and often it's the civil liberties that are damaged, but in an effort to bring the country together to do what needs to be done. And so specifically, we'll look at the War Production Board, the Office of War Mobilization, the Office of War Information, and the Office of Price Administration. The War Production Board and the Office of War Mobilization both concern themselves with the use of resources at home and how they would be used, basically, between the two of them. What was going to be produced, what was going to be used for the war, what was going to be used on the home front, and which workers were going to do it. To give a little story to this, my grandfather, who graduated from LSU sometime in the early 30s, he used to tell a story when I was younger about how he tried to enlist in 1941 multiple times and kept getting turned down. The Office of War Mobilization kept saying, no, we want you at home, because he had an engineering degree and he worked for Exxon. And the production of fuel and gas and use of resources was important for the war effort. Everyone was showing their patriotism by joining the military, and he wasn't able to do that. And so those are the types of things. That's the level of control that these agencies had in the government. And then you look on the right side of the different ways that were financed. We looked at the war bonds and rationing already, which was kind of like the do your part of it, victory gardens as well, scrap and recycling drives. But all of that went along with increased taxes. And for the first time, taking taxes straight out of paychecks. Okay, so watch this video. You may want to jot down these things. I know some of these were already in your vocabulary, but you may want to jot them down so that as the video plays, you can just jot down a couple of details about how these things function, not just necessarily what the definition is, but how they were being used.
The first key idea today says the mass mobilization of American society helped end the Great Depression, and the country's strong industrial base played a pivotal role in winning the war by equipping and provisioning allies and millions of U.S. troops. Now, as in World War I, the U.S. government organized a number of special agencies to mobilize U.S. economic and military resources for the wartime crisis. Early in 1942, the War Production Board was established to manage war industries. Later, the Office of War Mobilization, OWM, set production priorities and controlled raw materials. The government used what was called a cost-plus system, which had paid war contractors the cost of production plus a certain percentage for profit. Now, war-related industrial output in the United States was astonishing. By 1944, it was twice that of all the Axis powers combined. Instead of automobiles, tanks and fighter planes rolled off the assembly lines. American factories produced over 300,000 planes, 100,000 tanks, and ships with a total capacity of 53 million tons. So efficient were production methods that Henry Kaiser's giant shipyard in California could turn out a new ship in just 14 days. The war concentrated production in the largest corporations, as smaller businesses lost out on government contracts to larger businesses with more capacity. The 100 largest corporations accounted for up to 70% of wartime manufacturing. In addition to this, the War Powers Act gave President Roosevelt the power to expand the government, use censorship, and limit personal liberties, such as freedom of speech, something we've seen in many prior wartime crises. Now, the government and paid for its huge increase in spending, nearly $100 billion spent on the war in 1945 alone, by doing a few things. Number one, increasing the income tax, and number two, selling war bonds. For the first time, most Americans were required to pay an income tax, and in 1944, the practice was begun and off automatically by deducting a withholding tax from paychecks. Borrowing money by selling $135 billion in war bonds supplemented the tax increase. In addition, the shortage of consumer goods made it easier for Americans to save, just like during World War I. Now, few people opposed the war, so the government's propaganda campaign of posters, songs, and news bulletins was primarily to maintain public morale, to encourage people to conserve resources, and to increase war production. The Office of War Information controlled news about troop movements and battles. Movies, radio, and popular music all supported and reflected a cheerful, patriotic view of the war. For example, Norman Rockwell's popular illustrations of the Four Freedoms captured the liberties and values at stake in the war. The unity of Americans behind the war's democratic ideals helped that generation remember it as the Good War. Now, one federal agency, the Office of Price Administration, or OPA, regulated almost every aspect of civilian lives by freezing wages, prices, and rents, and rationing such commodities as meat, sugar, gasoline, and auto tires, primarily to fight wartime inflation. People could be given in those ration stamps like you see on the left hand side. In addition to this, Americans recycled and planted victory gardens, all in the effort to help support the war effort. In addition to this, war production created new jobs, it stimulated the economy, and, as we can see from this chart right here, it helped to end the Great Depression.